This is part 2 of thinking about a source's role in our work, in particular in our research papers or other sorts of academic writing. In the video for part 1, I discussed a little bit about what this means in terms of the source's role, and that it's understanding why we're using it, what it's doing for our work in terms of helping us think about something or provide evidence, and that understanding the role can also help us understand perhaps how we might want to incorporate it. So its role could directly relate to the way that we use it in our work, whether we summarize, paraphrase, quote, or some kind of mix of those things. I also had taken a look at a couple of assignment prompts to understand this first thing on the list, which is looking at how instructions or prompts tell us what to do with the source. And I started looking at another example a little bit more closely. That example is by Emily S. Fahani Smith, and I had shown how she had done some interviews and reading, particularly in psychology, philosophy, and neuroscience, and that these actions essentially are connected to this idea of how a source is shaping argument. It would have raised questions for her. It would have developed her line of thinking. It helped her draw some conclusions so that she's able to write this piece that she's writing. We also are looking at how she's used a work of fiction by the author George Eliot, and that in summarizing what's going on with the characters in this particular piece, Smith is essentially using this source as an extended example, and she's using fictional characters to really take the place of real characters. It's helpful that George Eliot, as a fiction writer, is pretty much an expert on, or was, she's no longer alive, but George Eliot is one of many authors who really gets the human condition or is able to get into the human mind to demonstrate how we often think and behave and things like that. So in this case, Smith is using a work of fiction that explores human ideas and human motivations to serve as an extended example. So on the one hand, that does help suggest it's making Smith think a little bit, but it's also serving as an authoritative voice in a way that George Eliot and Eliot's ideas are helping to support the claims or to demonstrate it. It's also serving as evidence. Again, a lot of times students are thinking of evidence as it has to be the results of a study. That is evidence. Or it has to be numbers from a survey. That is evidence. But evidence can also be examples that prove it or demonstrate it or show it in a very convincing, logical way. And that is partly what's happening here with this extended example from Middlemarch. What Smith then does after the extended example is that she pulls that into the real world and she ties it back to things like research studies. If you look towards the end of her work, we see that she's connecting the wisdom, and she actually says that, the wisdom of a novel, and she's, again, coming to a conclusion that meaning, so one's life, the meaning of life, satisfaction with life, is not found in success and glamour, but in the mundane, so the everyday, the existence overall, and that Eliot's novel is demonstrating that. She then ties it to studies. And in this case, she's saying one study and then another study, and she's hyperlinking. That's okay for this kind of writing that she's doing. If she was writing this as an academic paper, she should name the study and then she would have a parenthetical citation if it's an MLA, for example. But because she's writing for the newspaper and it's online, using hyperlinks is fine. Also thinking about who her audience is and that they're reading this more casually. They're not looking at it as a researched paper. It's okay that she's kind of mentioning a study and another study. But again, the hyperlinks are taking us to those sources. So if we click on those, we find that the first study that she hyperlinks goes here. And if I zoom in a little bit, we can see that this is coming from a journal called Developmental Psychology. It was published in 2015. We have the title, Mexican American Adolescents, Family Obligation, Values, and Behaviors, Links to Internalizing Symptoms Across Time and Context. Now imagine if this was the title that was going into the New York Times. The audience would look at that and say, I have no idea what that's about, and I'm not really sure that I want to read it. So instead, they see something, as she's titled it, You'll Never Be Famous, and that's okay. Her title points to her audience. It shows that she's thinking about her audience, but she, as sort of the in-between who has read the expert study, she's able to take the information that's here. Let me go back to Harvard, have it provide the evidence and also maybe help her develop her claims so that she can write about it and draw the conclusions in this piece. Let's take a look at another example. So again, here's one of the studies that she's linked to. This is the other study that she's linked to. Again, we see that it's coming from an academic journal. In this case, it's the Journal of Happiness Studies. That we have this very long title, shows us that this is not for the casual reader. This is not the student reader who's going to the New York Times opinion section. Instead, we have authors who are doing studies. We can look through this and see how this very much fits the expectations or the conventions of an academic piece of writing that Smith has the expertise to understand and to repackage for her readers. What she's doing then, as we scroll down to find them again, is she's referencing them. So here, going back to Harvard, these sources are serving as evidence. Also, even though she's not naming them, she's hyperlinking to them so we can locate them. In an academic paper, it might make sense for her to reference them in the sentence, although often not. But if she did, or she's certainly using them as a cited source, they become authoritative. These are experts. They are publishing their work in recognized journals. This is academic. So their peers have looked at this and said, yeah, this is quality stuff. So those sources she's linked, that's how she's incorporated them, and she's paraphrasing and summarizing some of their content. Again, that's how she's incorporating them, but they are serving as evidence. They are serving as authoritative voices, and they're also helping her line of thinking. So the last thing on this list is a source that may be offering a counter argument. In other words, it's maybe completely disagreeing and you're going to respond to that, or you lay out what the opposition says so that you can provide a response. That would be what counter argument means. But this other part where it says that the source might complicate your own position, it could very well mean that it's showing you an opposite view, but it also could be that it's making you maybe shift a little bit, or it's not as clear cut as an either or. It's showing that there is some more complexity to it. So the counter argument we can think of as maybe a disagreement, although it doesn't always have to be, but that's often how we'll think about it, that it's this countering. Here's what I say, and that's what the other side says. Or here's what one view is, the opposite view, or a dissenting view, or an opposing view is something else. And so it can show multiple sides to an issue. It could challenge what we're saying, or it could be a starting point. We see what the other side has said, and then the rest of our work responds. So that's the role, is that the source serves as the counter argument. But again, to come back to this idea of complicating an idea, it could be that maybe you started off believing one thing, and now you're finding out it's much more complex than you realized. Or it could be that that your research is pointing you in a particular direction, and then you see something else that shows that it's not as clear, or it isn't as readily understood as it may have seemed. And so complicating can mean that it's just now much more complicated. It's more complex than it may have seemed, or that you may have assumed. So I'm going to quickly take a look at a student example that uses sources in different ways. In some ways, this example does use sources in the ways that Harvard has laid out. But I'm also going to use this as a way to point out that sources can have slightly different roles than are mentioned in the Harvard Guide. The first thing I'm going to point to is that here's an example of somebody using their own story. She's writing about herself and what her own thoughts were. She's actually using a quote from her own mind, which is sort of not what we would consider to be a quote in an academic sense, but the idea that she's in a way serving as an authority. She's experienced these things before. She's writing from her own perspective. She's describing how she has felt in relationship to things like depression, anxiety, and other sorts of mental health conditions. So she's using herself as evidence. She could have just as easily told somebody else's story, a real person with real experiences, and that becomes evidence. It becomes a voice of authority. So there's multiple uses there for herself as a source. We also see on this front page, she's used an image, and she's borrowed this from somewhere else, so she's cited it. That makes it a source of a kind. But instead of providing information or detail or evidence, what this source ends up doing is sets a stage. It might help create a mindset. It might set a mood or a feeling. And in this case, we can see the words trust, strength, and focus in the image, which already start to give a sense that this project is about fighting depression. We can see more of that in her title, Weather the Storm, Fighting Against the Clouds. But here she's using an image that has words in it, in which case, again, it's acting as a source. She's borrowed it from someplace else. And it's establishing the mood, the mindset, the position that she's hoping the audience starts the reading of the rest of her piece. So I'm going to look at this next page that she has. Here is an example of how sources can serve as definitions, or they can provide definitions. Very often students think of definitions as only coming from a dictionary. That is one way to understand a definition, but we can also think of definitions as what are the boundaries? What are the examples? How do we understand what it is? And in this case, she's using a number of sources to define what, not only in terms of we have maybe the clinical description of it, but then as we continue to click through, there's more information about helping us understand what it is, even if we don't understand why it happens or how we're supposed to do anything about it. Helping understand the what is where the source comes into play a role. Here we have other images. In this case, these images are connecting with the written definition to help create another understanding, or maybe help the audience relate the visual to the written content. Excuse me. So I want to take a look at one more thing here. I'm going to look at her page that she's called Resources. Now, again, student project, I think it could have had a different title. This is instead supposed to be ways to help or ways for an audience to get involved. Here are different ways of understanding what sources can do. In this case, she's pointing her audience to charities that collect money to help fight anxiety, depression, brain behavior, that kind of thing. So I think there could have been a bit more explanation here about why these things are included in the project overall, but the source is playing a role. In this case, they probably have helped her develop some of the other ideas that are in the project, but they also serve as a place for the audience to act, so the audience can do something. That's a little bit different with what we would call new media writing, that things that are on the internet we can do that a lot easier. We can click on something, we can go to another page. Traditional media, it might be a little bit harder, although occasionally we will see in certain kinds of writing, here's a resource to use, or here's something to do to help. So that's what these sources are doing. If we look further down the page, we see a section that she's called Further Reading. In this case, these are sources that have certainly helped develop her thinking. They've given her ideas. She's used some of that in there, but it's also serving a role for the audience to do further reading. So the role that these things are playing here is to say there's much more to know. These are expert or authoritative voices, but they're also going to take the audience out of the project into more complex, more complicated ideas than what are being covered in this. So if we look through, again, this is a student example, but if we take a look, we've got multiple uses of sources in this project. Again, we looked at this Smith piece. It's an opinion piece. She's using multiple sources in multiple ways. If I were to dig into these academic pieces, we could see the same thing. And even on this first page, they're referencing other sources. So the sources that are used in these authoritative pieces also have roles to play. You as writer should think about not only what it is that you're finding, but what those sources are doing to influence you, influence your thinking, and influencing your writing.